Beginning in the mid-15th century, Portuguese explorers such as Nuno Tristão and Antonio Goncalves began trading along West Africa, kidnapping Africans and taking them to Portugal by 1441. This sparked a shift from trading gold and ivory to enslaved people. A shift driven by Europe's growing demand for labor in the Americas, especially on sugar plantations, and by the decimation of indigenous populations due to disease. Although slavery existed in Africa long before, European arrival massively expanded and commercialized it. African rulers and merchants, including those in kingdoms like Oyo, Dahomey, Congo, Orungu, and others, became key suppliers. They captured enslaved people through warfare, raids, or judicial punishments and sold them in exchange for European commodities: guns, textiles, alcohol, metal goods, enhancing their power domestically. Europeans depended on these African elites to procure captives. An Ask Historians post summarized this cooperation. European presence and trade in enslaved people was heavily dependent on the cooperation and permission of local communities, and rulers, larger states or empires, were able to disrupt the trade by blocking roads and preventing merchants to come to the shore. A key European instrument was the Royal African Company, established in 1660 under the Stuart monarchy. It monopolized English trade along Africa's coast, shifting focus from gold and silver to enslaved people. Between 1660 and 1752, it shipped more Africans to the Americas than any other English enterprise. Prominent English traders, like Edward Colston, deputy governor of the RAC, 1689 to 1690, oversaw the trafficking of tens of thousands of captives in this era. The trade formed the notorious triangle: European goods sold to Africa, captives shipped to the Americas, the Middle Passage, marked by brutality, overcrowding, disease, and high death rates, and plantation goods, sugar, tobacco, cotton, sent back to Europe. From approximately 1526 onward, Portuguese slaving voyages continued, followed by Spain, Britain, France, Holland, and Denmark. Over the life of the trade, 10 to 12 million enslaved Africans were transported, with an estimated 2.5 million dying en route. African elites were far from passive. Kingdoms like Dahomey became militarized suppliers, using captives from conquered neighbors to trade with Europeans in exchange for firearms and other goods. Newer polities such as Orungu in Gabon rose by dominating European-linked coastal trade. And intermediaries like Francisco Felix de Souza, a Brazilian-born trader based in Ouida, operated at the nexus of African and European interests, becoming a powerful figure in the region's slave commerce. Thus, the transatlantic slave trade was a mutually dependent system. Europeans created demand for labor in the New World, provided transportation, financing, and the means to transport millions across the ocean. African elites supplied captives harvested from internal warfare and political upheaval, capitalizing on European demand to enrich and empower themselves in local power struggles. The result was a system that devastated African societies, causing depopulation, destabilizing states, and fueling internal warfare, while building the wealth of European powers and colonial plantations in the Americas. This alliance between European demand and African agency did not only shape centuries of brutal commerce, it reshaped economies, geopolitics, and demographics on both sides of the Atlantic, leaving a haunting legacy that is still reckoned with today. The Royal African Company, RAC, was a crown-chartered English trading company founded in 1660 under King Charles II's restored Stuart monarchy. Initially created as the Company of Royal Adventurers trading to Africa, it received a monopoly on trade with West Africa, originally focused on gold, silver, and ivory. However, after its reorganization and recharter in 1672 as the RAC, the company's attention swiftly pivoted to enslaved Africans, turning them into its primary commodity. Backed by royal power, including Governor Duke of York, later King James II. The RAC operated forts and trading posts along some 5,000 miles of Africa's coast from Senegal to the Cape. Strategically positioned forts, such as Cape Coast Castle and Ouidah, served as collection centers where local elites delivered captives obtained through warfare, kidnapping, or sale. In the 1680s, the company transported approximately 5,000 enslaved people per year, branded with DOY, Duke of York, or RAC. It sponsored hundreds of slaving voyages during this era. Over its monopoly period, the RAC's own fleets carried at least 187,697 captives across the Atlantic on 653 voyages between 1672 and 1731, with about 38,497 deaths en route. According to some records, including the Company of Royal Adventurers phase, 1662 to 1672, total transport exceeded 212,000, with nearly 44,000 perishing on board. The British Crown and London merchants financially profited enormously. Investors and royals alike were acutely aware of the business's brutality. In the 1680s, slave trade profits powered City of London's growth and colonial expansion. Military actions were even launched in Africa to protect RAC operations, as in the Komenda Wars, 1694 to 1700, in present-day Ghana. However, mounting pressure from English private merchants, especially in Bristol and Liverpool, led Parliament to pass the Trade with Africa Act of 1698, ending the RAC's monopoly. Although the RAC survived in a diminished role, private traders surged ahead, shattering its stranglehold. Interestingly, Parliament licensed private trade by imposing a 10% duty paid to the RAC, meaning the company continued to benefit even without exclusive rights. While Britain's overall British slave exports exploded, reaching over 20,000 annually by century's end, the RAC's direct involvement began to wane after 1731, shifting focus back to gold dust and ivory. By 1752, the company was dissolved, its forts and assets transferred to the African Company of Merchants, which continued operations on the Gold Coast until 1821. In 1698, in response to mounting pressure from English private merchants, especially in Bristol and Liverpool, Parliament passed the Trade with Africa Act, initiated in 1697, received royal assent June 5, 1698, formally terminating the Royal African Company's, RAC, exclusive monopoly on English trade with Africa, including the slave trade. Up until that point, the RAC, chartered in 1672 under King Charles II, had controlled England's African trade, managing forts and factories along the Gold Coast, and transporting approximately 190,000 enslaved Africans between 1672 and 1731. But private merchants in Bristol and Liverpool, frustrated by limited access, had been illegally trading since the 1670s, refusing to be excluded. The new act introduced a 13-year free trade period, but with a catch. It mandated a 10% duty on exports to Africa, payable to the RAC to support its forts. This mechanism allowed private merchants to participate legally and ensured the RAC continued to reap some profits from the trade, even as its monopoly ended. Almost immediately, private traders outpaced the RAC. In 1698–99 alone, private fleets from London, Bristol, and Liverpool launched over 36 ships, compared to just 15 RAC vessels, resulting in a 4-to-1 volume ratio. By 1701, as much as 92% of slave exports from England were operated by private merchants, leaving the RAC with a mere 8% market share. Bristol quickly rose as a slaving powerhouse. Local merchants had built deep coastal ties in Calabar, Bonny, and Angola, and by the 1720s, Bristol annually dispatched about 39 slave ships, delivering roughly 37.6% of all British slave voyages between 1739 and 1748. Around the same time, Liverpool began to outshine both Bristol and London. By the mid-1740s, Liverpool had become Britain's foremost slaving port. By 1750, Liverpool was responsible for 62% of British slave voyages, with Bristol holding about 3.3%. Nationwide, the volume of British slave exports exploded, from around 5,000 enslaved people per year in the 1680s to more than 20,000 annually by century's end. As private trade surged, the RAC saw its role decline. Having lost its primary income from slave exports, by 1731 the company ceased slaving altogether and focused on trading gold dust and ivory, items less contested and profitable under its remaining infrastructure. Though the RAC continued to manage forts along the coast, its direct participation in the slave trade had effectively ended. In 1750, Parliament passed another act dismantling the RAC entirely, transferring its assets to the newly formed African Company of Merchants, managed by delegates from London, Bristol, and Liverpool, cementing the permanent shift to privately operated slaving networks.